I lived in a small town in the Midwest. I worked at a historic, but failing dual-screen theater. Unfortunately, the building itself was on its last leg, and the interior cosmetic renovations hadn't been made since the mid-80s, when a wall was built over the original stage and converted into a cinema. However, I adored the building, and was deeply saddened by its decrepit state. Many of the locals didn't care much for the theater once they started showing movies, and business dropped enormously from then to when I was employed there in 2007. Most of my shifts I barely saw more than a dozen people for each showing, if that. Some days we didn't even have a single person come in. My manager and I eventually became good friends, and he gave me a key to perform nightly janitorial duties. Needless to say, I was psyched. I loved the idea of coming in after hours to work and try to make the theater look more presentable, and not a typical smelly discount shithole. I would purchase cleaning supplies myself, and brought my mom's vacuum in because the theater didn't have one. I tried as much as a 17-year-old could to make the place more attractive, because it seemed everyone else gave up on her. One Friday night at around 12 a.m., I decided to borrow my uncle's steam cleaner to clean up the seats in the second theater. It was a lengthy task, but I had just got done smoking a joint with a buddy, and I had no issue finishing my night off listening to music and cleaning with a buzz. I entered the theater as usual and began completing petty tasks before tackling the big job. Eventually I entered the second theater and experienced a very uneasy feeling. I have never felt uncomfortable in there before, but for some reason I couldn't shake this pressing feeling on my chest. I assumed I was a little panicky from the pot. I turned my music down and started getting to work to try and get my mind off it. I had my back facing the screen and was scrubbing the second to last row near the exit when I suddenly heard a lot of rustling coming from behind the screen. This didn't come as much of a shock, considering that we've had pest issues in some of the storage rooms behind the screens. Thinking it was a raccoon trying to hide after hearing the drowning noise of my steam cleaner, I continued on and didn't pay much mind to it, until the rustling became very distinct. Whatever the noise was coming from under the screen inside the large metal grate that leads to the stage behind the screen, and whatever it was big. I turned my cleaner off and stared at the grate, practically frozen in fear and continuing to reassure myself that it was a raccoon or maybe even a dog or something. The noise became more prominent, and after what seemed like hours of me just staring at the grate, trying to determine what the creature was, the metal grate made a slow and ominous screeching noise as it began to push out from the inside. I continued to stare in intense fear as I witnessed what came tumbling out. A nearly bald head with a couple of strands of gray dirty hair greeted me before an old naked woman, absolutely covered in dirt, insects, and blood, came crawling out on all fours and looked directly at me. She paused as she was fully out and forcefully grinning at me with her toothless mouth. I'm not sure how much time went by, but I honestly felt like my feet had melted into the floor. I truly thought I was hallucinating. The way she was positioned like that seemed unreal, and although I was terrified, I think I was more perplexed by her contour. I thought she was a character from Silent Hill I had hallucinated, and that I was tripping on some really bad weed. This is what was playing over and over again in my mind, until she started crawling very quickly towards me without saying a single word, maintaining her grin with her head cocked back and her sagging breasts bouncing back and forth, hitting her bloody arms and smearing dirt and blood together. At that moment I pissed myself and jumped over the last 2 rows of seats. I still can't believe I did that in one leap, and ran as fast as I could to the exit door. I could hear distant shuffling as I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and ran to the police station, which was a couple of buildings away. I gave them the key, called my manager, and told them I wasn't going back. The woman who crawled after me, according to the police, was a homeless schizophrenic meth addict who decided to take up residency under the screen after managing to enter through a small opening from the outside of the building. When they arrived, she was crawling around in circles in the lobby. It appeared to them that she had been staying there for at least a week to shoot up meth, and she more than likely watched me on my janitor days, grinning that toothless grin as I swept away, unaware of her being there. It was definitely the absolute scariest moment of my life, and needless to say, I stopped coming in by myself to clean up. Since then, the place has closed and is completely boarded up. I miss it greatly, but whenever I come back to the area, I still wonder if she's sleeping in there. This happened to me when I was in 11th grade. I'm a female, and I tend to be a people pleaser. I never like to call anyone out, reject anyone outright, or act like someone is being weird. I'm also a bit open-minded, and I tend to go with the flow. School started in early September, and in my marine biology class, I noticed that there was this boy that kept staring at me from the corner of my eye. I just made one of those half smiles towards him to acknowledge him, and went on about my assignment. I really did not think much of it for a couple of weeks, even though he continued to stare. He was very skinny and tall, had brown hair. His eyes were so brown that they looked black. He had a generally nondescript face, other than his super dark eyes. One day he decided to say hi. I said hello back to him, and he told me his name, which was Alex. I told him mine, but he said that he already knew my name. That wasn't a surprise, as I have rather large handwriting, and he could have easily watched me write my name down on one of my papers. Since he was staring at me so much, it was kind of odd that he didn't really have any facial expression when he flatly said that he knew my name. I just sort of laughed it off, said, "Oh, okay," and began putting my things in my bag as the bell was about to ring. I only had a few friends, and we always sat at the same table during lunch. We were all rather quiet, and most times read while we ate. That means I usually don't look around the lunchroom, as I have my eyes in my book. This day my friend finished her novel, so I decided to put mine away and just talk. I immediately noticed Alex staring inside at us from the courtyard tables. He never seemed to be embarrassed that I noticed him. I showed him to my friend and told her about my class with him. She found it to be super creepy, but I said he's probably harmless and was just socially awkward. I arrived in marine biology a little early later that day, and so it was just myself, Alex, and one other girl for about 10 minutes. I did that half smile at Alex, and then decided to break out my book and start reading again. He had his hands folded over his mouth and was staring again. This time, it just felt awkward, because we were basically alone now. I glanced over at him and kind of raised my eyebrows, as if to say, "Yes?" He looked me up and down very slowly, and I asked him if he was okay. He said yes, and that he was just inside of his head, thinking, "Okay, whatever, that's fine." The next day at lunch, there was a little piece of paper on the table that we sat at. It had my name on the front. Not just my first name, my first and middle name. I opened it, and it said something like, "I wonder what your asshole would look like with a PVC pipe shoved up it." What the fuck? I looked around. I didn't see Alex, but I immediately knew it was him. I was very scared to come to class later that day, but he wasn't there. I felt a lot better about not seeing him. The note itself was gross and embarrassing. I didn't want to show any administrators because of that, so I just threw it out. I went to the bus area at the end of the day, like usual, but this time, I noticed Alex leaning on one of the pillars with his backpack on one shoulder. I literally felt chills down my spine when I noticed a white PVC pipe poking out of the top of his backpack through the zippers. I didn't give him any reaction to my knowledge, even though I'm sure he had watched me read the note. The next morning, I made an appointment with a counselor and had my class changed She was very reluctant to do that for me, because we were already in the school year well over a month and a half, but I think since I have a history of good grades and behavior, she helped me out. I spent the rest of the year avidly avoiding him. He kept staring at me at lunchtime, and one time he took photos of me at the bus area without my consent. Even though it was against school policy, I got some pepper spray for when I get off at my bus stop. I have no clue what happened to him, because when 12th grade began, he was no longer at our school. I'm not sure if I even want to know how he turned out.
مرسی که این ویدیو دیدید. حتما لایک، سابسکرایب، کامنت فراموش نشه و تا ویدیو بعد خداحافظ.